Good afternoon, everybody. We are just giving people a minute or two to get on their Zoom link and join us for our LDC lunchtime series. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay. We are almost at 20 people. So I think, David, if you're good, I'll go ahead and get started. Oh, a couple more people. JD signed up yesterday. I'm letting him in. Okay. Okay, everybody, welcome to our third session of our Land Development Council lunchtime series. Just a couple housekeeping items. Please make sure your camera is on and you have named yourself a name that we can recognize so that you may receive your credits for professional engineer, land surveyor, and landscape architect. I see a couple of you on here are not named correctly, and once we get started, I'll reach out to you and help you get named correctly for those credits. So again, cameras on. I am Carrie Swift. I'm the Director of Events for the Maryland Building Industry Association, and I am proud to present our presenter today, David S. Thaler. He is the principal at D.S. Thaler and Associates, LLC, a leading engineering, surveying, and land planning firm that has designed more than 4,000 projects in the Mid-Atlantic region. He is actually the most credentialed engineer in Maryland, which I did not know, David. He is a fellow at the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National Society of Professional Engineers, and the Royal Geographical Society. He's a board-certified diplomat at the National Academy of Forensic Engineers, as well as the American Academy of Water Resources Engineers. He's published more than 250 articles and 5 books. In July 2019, he was named the top professional engineer in the United States. He holds the top professional engineering award in Maryland, now known as the Thaler Prize, Maryland's highest military honor, the Distinguished Service Cross. He's a former guest scholar at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where he taught a program entitled Thaler on Land Use. He also, interestingly enough, and I just learned this today, is believed to be the only person ever awarded an honorary JD from the University of Maryland School of Law, entitling him to practice at any bar and grill in Maryland. So without further ado, the bartender, David Thaler.
Well, thank you so much, Carrie. Really, in my next life, I want to come back as a bartender. So thank you for noting that. Welcome back to everybody. On this, our third installment of the 2021 Virtual Land Development Series. This is my 6th year in doing this in this format. And frankly, I was a little skeptical about doing it as a webinar, but it's turned out to be wildly successful. And I'm so glad we have so many customers that sign up every week. Now, last week, we provided an orientation to the structure of the development industry and to what developers do and why they do it. And we talked about the 4 basic elements, which I like to call constraints that we need to consider: marketing, financial, physical, and regulatory political. But today I want to dig deeper into the feasibility analysis of a piece of land. And if you take nothing away from my talk today, I'd like you to remember these points. If you want to be successful in land development, know what you're doing, hire a successful team, do a feasibility study, manage your risk. And today, just for you, I'm going to reveal the secret of success in land development, which I learned as a very young engineer. So stop your multitasking at the end of the talk, and I'm going to reveal a secret that I like to call the iron law of development that is worth the price of admission. But let's start the day with physical features. Really, the first thing that we should analyze in a feasibility. This is the extent to which a property can be developed, and really whether it can be developed at all is largely determined by its physical features and how they relate with the regulatory process. And the items which follow, among others, should be carefully considered and understood prior to the purchase of a piece of raw property. Now, we will continue to use the Helfrich property here in Woodlawn near our office as a case study, much like we did last week. And it's a very simple piece of property, but it has some interesting lessons associated with it. And you'll recall it's 13 acres. It's a rental townhouse community, but we're going to analyze it as if it were for sale. Now, really, the first issue to consider in any land development project is access, which is a fundamental component of whether land is developable. Now, while it's extremely unusual to find a property that's completely landlocked, that does not mean that access for development purposes can always be provided. The existing access to a parcel, it may be too narrow, it may be an easement or a prescriptive right instead of a fee, or it may be unsuitably located. And in order to provide access to lots, in most cases, a public road must be constructed and dedicated, though occasionally development upon private roads in certain jurisdictions is sometimes permitted. Now, most jurisdictions require a minimum right-of-way width of at least 40 to 60 feet, some even more for public roads, but often there must be additional property available for the grading of supporting slopes. Bear with me for just a moment. If an access of sufficient width cannot be provided, the property may be unable to be developed. And while the public has the right of eminent domain using its condemnation power, the public cannot acquire property for private uses. And therefore, if grading rights on offsite property cannot be obtained, then a property may not be able to be developed. Now, the transportation article of the Annotated Code of Maryland grants the State Highway Administration control over access upon state highways. And except for restricted access highways, the state cannot totally prohibit access from a state road to a property, but it can control the location and type of entrance. That is, it may only allow a limited access entrance. For instance, the access requirements of the state, as well as the local jurisdiction, can severely impact the development potential and therefore the value of the property. If the State Highway Administration finds the access onto a state highway unacceptable for a full entrance, it may require an entrance which allows only limited turning movements, such as a right turn in or a right turn out. Such an entrance can be devastating for commercial properties. If you're a Dunkin' Donuts, for instance, you want to be on the going to work side of the road and not the coming home from work side. And it could be devastating for any property for that matter, which requires access from more than one direction. Now, while there are numerous requirements related to the location of entrances, many of them are technical and beyond the scope of today's talk. However, there are several that are frequently encountered, which anyone involved in raw property should be aware. Entrances on the opposite side of a street from each other should be either directly opposite or a sufficient distance apart. Now, while the required separation distance varies, and accepted standards is generally a minimum of 100 feet. That is, entrances should be 100 feet apart from each other if they're not directly opposite. And that distance is necessary to prevent confusion as to who has the right of way when the entrances are opposing. Now, in addition, entrance locations are also constrained by what is known as sight distance. That's S-I-G-H-T, not S-I-T-E. Sight distance may either be horizontal or vertical, and an entrance to a highway which is on the inside of a curve may limit the distance around the curve from which oncoming vehicles can be seen. The higher the design speed of the road, the greater the distance must be to provide for a safe entrance location. Now, there are intersection site distance and there is stopping site distance. We usually consider intersection site distance, which I just talked about, but stopping site distance comes up, but that's too technical for today's talk and is the subject of another talk. Likewise, there is another situation that is frequently encountered, and entrances which are just over the crest of a hill do not have sufficient vertical sight distance to see traffic approaching from the far side of the hill. And the higher the design speed of the road, the greater the vertical sight distance must be for a safe entrance location. In the vertical situation, it's best to be either at the crest of the hill or sufficiently away from the crest. And the two situations of which to be especially aware are when a property's entrance is either close to the crest of the hill or on an inside of a curve. And it's possible, we have hit this before, that properties with extensive road frontage can be so affected by sight distance and other regulations that no safe entrance can be provided. In that circumstance, the property could be undevelopable or its development potential could be restricted unless a suitable entrance location can be provided. Now, in Maryland, representatives of the State Highway Administration are assigned to local jurisdictions, and it's recommended that the SHA representatives be consulted and that they review the suitability of an entrance location prior to an investment decision. And often engineers from the local departments of traffic engineering or public works can check the suitability of entrance location on local roads, as can private traffic engineers. As a very general rule, the sight distance is 100 plus 10 times the design speed of the road. So if, for instance, the road has a design speed of, say, 35 miles an hour, the required sight distance would be on the order of 450 feet. Most jurisdictions, however, follow the AASHTO standards, American Association of State Highway and Traffic Organizations. And for a more detailed answer to required sight distance, their manual would have to be consulted. Now, going to our example, is the Helfrich property is located on Dogwood Road, and the slide to the left is looking to the right coming out of the entrance. The slide to the right is looking to the left coming out of the entrance. And you can see that this is a pretty hilly road, but the crest of both hills are sufficiently far away from the entrance. And so it would be safe to have a full entrance here, and the entrance would not be restricted. Even in an obvious case like this, it would still be best to have one of the county public works engineers come out and double check. Now, the next element that is critical to determining development potential is topography. Now, topographical maps and so-called GIS tiles are usually available through the individual jurisdictions, and very often GIS is now available on the internet. Now, in areas where the maps or tiles are not available, USGS maps with show topography with large contour intervals can be used to develop an understanding of the existing topography on a property. Now, a property may have portions that are too steep to be properly served by roads or driveways, and areas that are too steep are difficult to build upon at best and may be completely unsuitable for construction. Existing site topography often guides the design location of proposed roads and improvements. And normally roads must be graded at less than 10%, although the optimum grade for a road is usually between 2% and 8%, although there are exceptions. And grade, of course, is the change in elevation over a horizontal run expressed as a percent. 5 feet of rise along 100 feet of run, for example, is a 5% grade. Now, construction on steep slopes is often difficult, and most jurisdictions prohibit disturbance of steep slopes, generally defined as those greater than 25%, but some jurisdictions prohibit disturbance of 15 of slopes that are any greater than 15%. Now, construction on steep slopes can cause instability and erosion problems, which at a minimum must be addressed. And in considering whether to purchase a property, it's highly recommended that the topographic map be consulted and that the site also be walked in the field. It's amazing how many people don't do that. Physical inspection may indicate some features which were not shown on the photogrammetry or potentially problematic features which were not apparent on a two-dimensional map. I've been reading engineering plans for the better part of 50 years, and yet every time I go into the field, it looks different than I imagined it to be from the drawings, and often I find something that's not shown. I vividly remember one story when the surveyors came in and they had physically located a manhole cover in the middle of a yard, and it just didn't look right to me. And so it didn't feel right. And so I went out to the property to see what was going on. And sure enough, there was a manhole cover. Unfortunately, there was no manhole or sewer over it, but they had managed to pick up a manhole cover just sitting in the grass. You would not want to be designing your sewer into that manhole cover with no sewer under it. Now, in addition to being too steep, it's possible for a property to be too flat, although that seldom occurs in the Piedmont regions, which include most of Maryland west of I-95, but is certainly an issue on the Eastern Shore, for example. If a property is too flat, it may be difficult to properly design drainage, and it may be therefore unsuitable for roads or structures. Generally, roads of grades of at least 2% are necessary to provide proper drainage. Now, Helfrich, our example, is pretty flat. However, it does have a very interesting feature, a beautiful pond full of fish. I took the director of planning out here, and we caught quite a few fish. And this would be very hard to appreciate just from the GIS. You would need to see it in the field. And interestingly, even though it's a wonderful amenity, and we were able to save it, under then existing county regulations, you couldn't count it towards your open space requirement because it's not dry, and you couldn't use it for stormwater management because the outfall and release rates weren't engineered. And also, but we were a little bit unusually able to save this as an amenity. Now, also on the Helfrich property, it is very flat, and it's so flat, it's suspiciously so, and it didn't smell right to me, and that raised a red flag, but we'll get to that in a few moments. Now, the next I want to talk about is water and sewer. Now, most areas within the metropolitan district around Baltimore must be served by public sewer extensions if they're to be developed. And the availability of sewer can be determined from an examination of public works records like this one. This is called a key sheet. It's a little bit old-fashioned. They had them in the county, and they show the location of all the public and sewer water lines. Typically today, this is on the internet, but generally the location of water and sewer is available in the public records, either on the GIS or from the local public works department. Now, if the sewer is existing in your area, you must also determine if it's physically possible to extend the lines to the site. Now, sewerage usually flows by gravity, and therefore there must be sufficient fall between your site and the existing sewer for the system to really work. And in addition, there must be adequate right-of-way available for the construction of any of the required extensions. Now, coming back to our Helfrich property, our case study, this one is a wee bit unusual. There is sewer really nearby. It's right at the top of the hill I showed you in the prior slide, but it's too high and the sewerage must be pumped. And in Baltimore County, there are two options. You could have a public pumping station or grinder pumps. Now, because these were actually rental townhomes, it would have been possible to install a private pumping station. A public pumping station would cost something on the order of $1 million, sometimes more, and is required, at least in Baltimore County, if there are more than 100 units using it. But for less than 100 units, the county will permit what are known as grinder pumps, which is the option that we selected in this particular case. Now, these are just like, these are macerators. These are just like big garbage disposals, and they sit in underground casings. That's what you're looking at here, out in the yard, in the front or the back of the home. Interestingly to me, there does not seem to be much home buyer resistance to grinder pumps. Here are two cheek by jowl next to the Helfrich townhomes, and when installed, they're really pretty unintrusive. They do change the financial relations between the developer and the builder, however, because the developer typically puts in the casing and the force main, and the builder ties in the pump to the house and installs the pump itself. Now, the next element of important feasibility is water supply. And unlike sewer systems, water systems flow under pressure and not by gravity, and consequently, under most circumstances, water lines can be extended with little concern for grade. And again, county records or GIS can help determine if water lines are proximate to your property, but I always like to visit the site and check for fire hydrants. If you don't take anything else away from this talk, I think it's very important in doing a feasibility to get all the public records and then physically go out to the site, and you will find errors and things that aren't on the records. Now, water lines have their own problem associated with it because they're, especially the older ones, generally made of ductile iron, and they tend to rust or tuberculate with age. And it's very common for old water lines after 50 years or so to have limited flow capacity. And so you conduct what's called a fire flow test to determine if the water line has sufficient flow for a particular development. Multifamily developments require more water pressure and more water volume than do single family. Now, occasionally there are entire areas which are subject to low water pressure, and these areas are generally mapped in the local public works department, and development may be prohibited or restricted until water service can be made adequate. And in order to be physically available, to have a property with public water and sewerage, it must be properly designated within the state-approved master water and sewerage plan, and if the Baltimore region, within the metropolitan district. Now, areas not served by public water and sewer, well and septic systems are typically utilized. Now, in the coastal plain of Maryland, water yields are typically very high. However, in the Piedmont area, there are many geological formations which produce low water yields. It is possible that a site may not yield a producing well at all. We've had lots with a dozen dry holes on it, for example. And an examination of the geological maps prepared by the Maryland Geological Survey can provide some insight into the geological state of the property, but ultimately a well test and the records at the county health department are the only things that will really determine an actual yield. Now, likewise, percolation tests should be taken to determine the suitability of a site for septic systems. A percolation test is conducted below the level of the septic tank. A hole is dug, water is poured into the hole, and the rate of outflow or percolation is measured. The percolation rate must be neither too fast, or the soil will provide no filtrative capacity, nor too slow, or the septic tank will overflow for our property to be deemed suitable. Properties which are at low elevations near streams or tidal areas or which have very poor drainage will not be suitable for septic systems. And every county in the state has a health department which is responsible for the approval of building sites. Percolation must be taken and approved prior to the recordation of a plat, and the Sustainable Growth and Agricultural Preservation Act of 2012, relatively new Maryland legislation, severely limits the use of septic tanks, and when they are permitted, they must use the best available technology, which is considerably more expensive than septic tanks without that technology. Next element to consider are watercourses and floodplains. Now, a stream may be a very attractive feature for development from a marketing point of view, but with every stream, there's typically associated a floodplain, which is the area inundated in a given rainstorm. Floodplains are regulated, and largely all construction is prohibited within the 100-year floodplain, which is typically the standard storm. The state of Maryland requires a permit for construction in most floodplains and will issue the permit if the pre-development hydraulic characteristics are maintained, but that's very difficult to get. And even if the floodplains were not regulated, construction in them is extremely ill-advised, especially with global warming, because any improvement within the floodplain is at the risk of inundation. Now, the 100-year storm is currently the accepted design storm, typically at the moment, and a 100-year storm refers statistically to the storm which has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And this statistical relationship also applies to other storm frequencies. For instance, a 10-year storm is a storm of such magnitude which has a 10% chance of occurring in any given year. And likewise, a 2-year storm has a 50% chance of occurring in any given year. Now, the width of the floodplain is what we're really concerned with, because that tells us how much land we're going to lose to development. And the width at a particular location is a function of the amount of water flowing to it and the topography on either side of the stream. And for a given amount of water, the floodplain will be wider for a shallow stream channel than it is for one which is deep and narrow. And civil engineers and hydrologists use computer modeling to determine the floodplain, and the amount of runoff at any given point is a function of several factors, including the following: the drainage area coming to the point, the land use characteristics, how much of the site is grassy or forested or impervious, the length and slope of the contributing channel, how long is the distance, known as the time of concentration, from the highest point in the drainage area to the lowest point. The shorter the distance and the steeper the slopes, the greater amount of runoff generated in a given storm. Now, although only an engineering study can compute the precise location of the floodplain, the Federal Insurance Agency, FIA, of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, publishes a series of flood maps which are readily available and which will give an indication of the major areas which are flood prone and within floodplains. And although the FEMA maps identify major floodplains with a pretty good accuracy, they aren't so accurate with the smaller tributaries and may not even map the smaller floodplains. So that only an engineered floodplain study can really correctly determine floodplain limits and elevations. Now, no matter how attractive a property may look on the surface, its subsurface conditions may render it inappropriate for development. Soil maps, which identify various soils and their development limitations, are available from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Now, a site may be underlain by impenetrable rock or have an extremely high water table, or it may have been used for dumping. This is extremely common. Subsurface explorations, either soil borings or test pits, should always be undertaken to determine the nature and suitability of the substrata. Borings can be prepared or test pits excavated with a backhoe at strategic locations very economically, but more than one developer has purchased property to discover trash buried beneath the surface. Now, as I alluded to before, Helfrich was an old country club, and it had a soccer field, there's a series of soccer fields on it, And it just didn't look right to me. And after as much time as I've spent in this business, I can just walk a site and sometimes things just don't feel right. And this site was in a hilly area and it just looked too flat. So we went out and we got a backhoe, $60 an hour or something like that. And we started digging some test pits. And sure enough, it was underlain by trash and rubble. Apparently, when one of the highways was being built, the owner of the property allowed them to dump the rubble on the site, then covered it up, made a very attractive a field with it. And we went out and we made a profile of the trash so that we could calculate exactly how much would have to be removed. And in fact, the townhouses, it turned out they would be cheaper to be constructed on treated wood pilings, which is how we were able to build them finally. But had we bought this, had the developer bought this property not knowing the trash was there, he would have been in for a big financial surprise, especially if that had been considered toxic and hazardous waste or had petroleum products associated with it. Now, the next element to talk about is suitable outfall. Every site must discharge its water in a way that does not damage the downstream property. And in order to do so, it needs what is termed a suitable outfall, which is very hard to define. But as Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once said in a very different context, you know it when you see it. He was talking about pornography, incidentally. A suitable outfall, you know it when you see it. And your drainage, which is typically concentrated and treated in a stormwater management facility, must discharge in a safe, non-erosive way. And this includes a road, a pipe, a defined channel, a stream, something like that. Now, the second picture in the upper left is a cornfield. A suitable outfall would not be discharging perpendicular to the rows in the cornfield. That would cause erosion and would be a trespass. That would not be a suitable outfall. The next element is adequate public facilities, with many jurisdictions in Maryland have, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, and many others. And these prohibit development in those areas where certain public facilities are inadequate. In Baltimore County, the County Council adopts maps of the basic services in the fall of every year. And these services that they map are traffic, sewage, water, and schools. Area of deficient services are mapped and development is prohibited in them for the duration of the deficiency. In Anne Arundel County, a development proposal must also have adequate public facilities, including schools, traffic, water and sewer, and police and fire. And a development in an area of inadequate facilities can proceed only if the developer corrects the inadequacy. Now, Montgomery County, interestingly, has had ADFO, adequate facilities, for years, and ADFO-driven moratoria, but just eliminated its moratoria for overcrowded schools, having found that it didn't work and didn't solve their overcrowded school problem. But adequate facilities are something to be considered in every jurisdiction and are usually well mapped. The next element is critical area. Maryland legislature adopted Section 81801, the critical area law, and this divided areas in the state into three types of development areas: intensely developed IDA, limited development LDA, and resource conservation areas. Suffice it to say that there are very difficult restrictions in each of these areas. The critical area is the area within 1,000 feet of the Chesapeake Bay or its major tributaries, and it is possible to increase the IDA and LDA, the areas which have some development potential to them, through a process called obtaining growth allocation, but that's difficult and a talk for another day. I'd like to talk about some environmental issues next. We're going to have on May 18th, Michael Powell, a superb environmental lawyer from Gordon Feinblatt, really dig deep into this. But in the context of feasibility, I want to talk about some environmental issues. The first are toxic and hazardous waste, and there is a law, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, known as CERCLA, better known as Superfund, which imposes severe liabilities upon and risk upon real estate owners. And CERCLA defines a long list of toxic and hazardous waste, and the act applies to anyone with a contractual relationship to a property. That is, you may not have contaminated property, but if you buy a contaminated property, you are responsible for its cleanup, which can be extremely expensive. And in order to protect property purchasers, there has a system has evolved, and it is very important to have a phase one environmental assessment performed by a competent environmental consultant. And a phase one includes the development history of the property, visual and other analysis to determine if it's likely that toxic and hazardous waste are present. Then if you do a phase one under the law, a property owner can then assert the phase one as a defense should environmental liability later arise. Now, if a phase one indicates the possibility of toxic and hazardous waste, then a phase two assessment should be undertaken. And a phase two study is a more comprehensive and detailed environmental assessment, which determines the presence of CERCLA defined hazardous materials. And phase three of the process is the mitigation and remediation of any waste itself. Property, I cannot emphasize this enough, property should not be purchased without a minimum of having completed a phase one study. You never know what's down there, as our previous example really proved. In the case of contaminated property, which we call brownfields, there is the availability of the VCP, the Voluntary Cleanup Program at MDE, and that is available, but very expensive and not typically for the development property that we deal with. Now, the next element to consider is forest conservation. And Maryland and various local jurisdictions have passed laws requiring forest conservation. Forest conservation requires first a forest stand delineation, a study to determine the extent and nature of forest resources, and the State Forest Conservation Act maintains that a certain percentage of forests be maintained. This is known as a threshold, and there is a mitigation requirement should clearing be proposed that below that threshold. And also there is what's known as an afforestation requirement, which requires a minimum amount of forest even where there is none initially. In addition, some jurisdictions like Baltimore County have specimen tree ordinances which require the protection of trees of a certain size and sometimes require what Baltimore County calls special variances before their removal. I want to talk a little bit about wetlands. Wetlands are considered to be highly sensitive and valuable environmental resources. They're classified as tidal or riparian and non-tidal. And typically, development projects encounter riparian or non-tidal wetlands. And the Federal Clean Water Act, as well as state and local laws, protect wetlands and provide for very severe penalties if they are disturbed. Prior to undertaking any development project, if the presence of wetlands is at all suspected, it's highly recommended that a qualified consultant perform a wetlands delineation. And even if the wetlands are not suspected, it's still advisable to have a cursory review. Under federal regulations, wetlands must have three characteristics, what they call diagnostic parameters: hydrology, hydrophytic vegetation, and hydric soils. These are basically circular definition. It simply more or less means wet soil. Hydrology means that water is close to the surface for at least 2 weeks during the growing season. And there are some types of plants which like to grow and some which will only grow in wet areas. And these become diagnostic parameters for wetlands, and these are called hydrophytic plants. Now, generally, soils contain iron, which gives them a reddish color. And when the soils are repeatedly inundated, the iron oxidizes anaerobically, and the soil assumes a dark gray or black color. And these types of soils are called hydric soils and are identified by their color. Now, on the slide, the image to the far right, you can see how black it is. That's a hydric soil. It's been wet over time. The iron has essentially rusted out, and then you can tell that becomes one of the diagnostic parameters for a wetland. But to be considered a wetland, soil must have all three of these characteristics. Now, you can disturb wetlands under certain circumstances. And there are two types of wetlands permits, individual and nationwide. Nationwide permits allow for minor disturbances, but these permits are difficult and expensive to obtain, and the best strategy is to avoid the wetlands where possible. Another element to be considered are historical issues, and these can radically affect property development. Among these are grave sites. Historically, backyard burials or burials in small family plots were very common, and these are often unmarked and undocumented. Now, disturbance of graves is really a bad idea and can result in hefty penalties and must be avoided. But I'll tell you, I've seen Poltergeist, the movie Poltergeist, and really, you don't want to mess with the graves. And if you have graves, you want to find them on site before the backhoe operator does to make sure that they are properly protected. Now, additionally, some counties require like Anne Arundel, require an archaeological investigation, and many counties have historic preservation laws which prohibit development on historic sites, generally but not always, those that are more than 50 years old. And sometimes development will be prohibited on historic settings as well. Now, most jurisdictions, as well as the state of Maryland, maintain an inventory of historic sites, which should be consulted prior to property purchase and development. Now, the next issue are title issues. We are encountering these much more frequently. I think that title reports are going back further now than they used to. I think they used to stop at 50 years, but we're coming up with title issues much more frequently than they did. And the first variety is covenants. Now, it's quite common for a property to be restricted by the use of a covenant. Now, for instance, a covenant may say that future lots have to be a certain minimum size, or may prohibit certain types of construction. Now, covenants are extremely difficult to remove, and it's not uncommon, especially in the Baltimore region, to find covenants against certain religious or racial groups. Those types of covenants, however, are no longer valid. Another issue we frequently had, very dangerous, are old roads or paper streets. These are more common than you would imagine. And back in the day, surveyors would subdivide property and create streets wherever. Very often they didn't get developed. But the problem is that every property owner which fronts on the paper street has a non-exclusive right to use that road. So it's very important to know where these paper streets are, even though they may not be visible in the field, and to avoid developing on them, because if a lawsuit is filed, it's been known for the judge to have the house removed. And finally, I talk about this in another lecture, but just because you have a deed to your property doesn't mean you actually own it. The deed, it could have been signed by the husband when the wife got the property in the divorce. The person signing it could have been mentally incompetent. There are all kinds of reasons why the person giving you the deed might not have gotten good title to it and can't pass better title than he got. It is very important to get good and merchantable title, and therefore I can't recommend enough that a title search be done as part, not when you close on the property, but as part of the feasibility of the property to see if there are any title issues that would affect your development. Now, one other unique item to the Helfich property is that there was a cell tower monopole in the middle of the property. Now, this was obvious, it was here, but it affected a development. Now, monopoles, and I guess cell towers, are designed not to tip over their whole length. They're designed when they break, they're designed to break in the middle. So they have a designed fall zone. So we had to calculate that designed fall zone and make sure that no houses were within the distance that wasn't safe from the monopole. And then what we like to do is prepare a plat during the feasibility, is prepare a sort of a plat of existing conditions. This is the Helfich property. It shows the zoning, the topo, the boundary, the wetlands, the forest buffer, the steep slopes, everything that you can think of. I like to put it in a graphic so that we can understand what it is and what the issues are and how we're going to deal with them. And then that, of course, leads to the final layout. Andrew, next one. Okay, so here's what we did here. You see where the entrance is, where I pointed it out earlier, and with two little roads, we were able to have a modest but very successful townhouse development. There were 1,200 people on the waiting list to move into this property, and here's what it looks like when it's all built. Today, it's called the Villages of Whitfield, and has been very successful. I want to talk briefly about the approval process. Now, when I started work in Pennsylvania, which has more than 2,000 boroughs and townships, and I was not surprised at how different all the subdivision approval processes seem to be. But it seemed as if there was some a hidden spine to them, because they were all different, but they were all very similar. And it took me a while to figure out why. And that's because they're all based, next one, Andrew, they're all based on this, a Standard City Planning Enabling Act, which was a model ordinance that was adopted by, it was promulgated by the US Department of Commerce, and it's been adopted in one form or another by almost every American jurisdiction. Now, the act had the act had several elements to it. First of all, it established a planning commission. It required that the planning commission make and adopt a master plan, and it prohibited the opening of any public roads until their location had been approved by the commission, and it made the subdivision of property illegal without planning commission approval. Finally, I suppose the subdivider was required to bond or otherwise guarantee the construction of the streets, usually with a contract, which came to be known as a public works agreement. And so in its very simplest form, the subdivision process really only consists of two real steps. One is approval by the Planning Commission, and the other is a public works agreement. But from that very simple framework has grown an extremely complex, convoluted process that in some jurisdictions contains more than 100 steps and the involvement of dozens of agencies. Now, here on the slide are the Anne Arundel County and the Baltimore City, somewhat oversimplified flowchart. Now, often the authority of the Planning Commission is delegated to the staff, usually the Director of Planning. And because it would be extremely time consuming to submit all the engineering at once for final approval, a multi-step process has evolved. In many jurisdictions, Howard County, for example, it's a 3-step process, sketch and final with an optional pre-sketch submittal. Now, in this region, Baltimore County has arguably the most sophisticated process, and its procedures are often adopted by other jurisdictions. And so I'd like to review that one in just a little bit more detail. Baltimore County divides its process into 2 phases, and however, our office adds a phase to that we call pre-phase 1. Pre-phase 1 includes gathering all the physical elements and constraints about the property. Generally, we do boundary and topographical surveys. We'd like to do that right up front, even though that's not always necessary. It's possible to work from the GIS, but it sure saves a lot of trouble later. We do the wetland analysis, the forest stand delineation, the floodplain, and the other environmental studies so that we completely understand and seek approval where necessary of the constraints of the property prior to entering the development process. Next in Baltimore County is the phase 1 process, and the first step is the concept plan. A concept plan is simply a sketch of what you want to do. You send out copies, and then you hold a community input meeting. At the community input meeting, anyone may ask questions and make comments, but needless to say, sometimes these meetings get quite heated. And on more than one occasion, I've been asked to step out to the parking lot and settle the issue like a gentleman. I tend to decline those. No matter where the proposed development is, the issues are often similar. Neighbors tend to voice strong concerns regarding traffic, overcrowded schools, too much density, and any change in their perceived character of the neighborhood, especially if the proposal is for less expensive housing than their own. Now, although widely misunderstood, the CIM has several not so obvious but very important purposes. First, the fact that certified letters go out to the neighbors who may never have spoken together creates a sense of urgency. And at this meeting, a wide variety of concerns and anxieties are usually expressed. Most have nothing to do with the development proposal, but a sympathetic, empathetic ear and an opportunity for simply to be heard tends to reduce the opposition. Secondly, neighbors actually live in the community and they know the community better than you ever will. And so often they are an excellent source of information and insight. And finally, when there is opposition, the CIM serves as a very effective discovery and lets you know what the issues are. Now, within a year of the CIM, a development plan must be filed, and the development plan is a highly engineered plan of the proposed development. Next slide, Andrew. The development plan is then set for a hearing before an administrative law judge, and the process is to resolve a conflict. There's an informal part of the hearing where the hearing officer tries to resolve issues, and then he holds a hearing, takes testimony from all sides. It's quasi-judicial, and finally makes a ruling. And in general, in Baltimore County, a plan that meets all the rules and regulations is required to be approved. And so while there have been some very protracted and intensely fought battles, most development plans in Baltimore County are ultimately approved. And so in summary, the phase 1 part has 4 main steps, taking about 5 or 6 months: concept plan, community input meeting, development plan, and hearing officers hearing. Then the phase two engineering begins. This is the extremely detailed engineering designs and includes construction drawings for stormwater management, sediment control, roads and utilities, et cetera. Now, there are many required construction drawings, but the process at this stage is generally very businesslike. The politics have really pretty well been dealt with earlier. Now, the culmination of the process is the record plat, which I always like to think of as magic. When one takes, for example, Helfrich and divides it on paper into townhouse lots, its value at least doubles, and you haven't done a single thing physically to the property other than to get a signature on a piece of paper. That simple signature is worth its weight in gold, and because it's so difficult to attain, and the final approval, the legal right to sell, is so valuable that it just this piece of paper immensely increases the value of the property. Now, finally, I want to leave you with one final thought. The secret of success in land development that I learned as a very young engineer. There was a lady engineer in Baltimore County. She was Steve Warfield's mother, if you known him. He's an MBIA member. It was Kath Warfield. She was one of the very few female engineers, and she was kind of very maternal. And one day I went in with some bonehead proposal to the director of public works and the chief engineer in Baltimore County. And I was right out of college and full of beans. And they basically said, this is the dumbest idea we ever heard. Don't darken my door again. And I walked out of the office very dejected. And Mrs. Warfield put her arm around me and she said, son, don't you know the first law of development? And I said, no, Mrs. Warfield, what's the first law of development? And she said, everything is developable. And I leave you with that thought. Happy developing, and I'll see you next week. And next week, we're going to dig much deeper. 2 weeks from now, on April 13th, we're going to dig much deeper into Euclidean zoning and some very exciting developments in the zoning world. And that'll be April 13th at noon. And I hope to see everybody then. Thank you. Sure.
Okay, so I did get a couple questions in the chat and we have a couple minutes, so good. I got the question, how long does it typically take to process a subdivision?
Typically in Baltimore County, we like to think about 18 months. It's about 6 months if things go well for the first phase to go from concept plan to approved development plan and hearing officer's hearing, and then it takes roughly a year to get shovel ready, get all the permits, and get going. So 18 months, 20 months is about right. Prince George's County, it's probably more like 2 to 3 years, and it could be more in the 2 to 3 year range in some of the more complex counties.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I thank you for putting your questions in the chat. Don't forget to use that. David, another question. What about appeals?
Well, these things can be appealed. If you can be approved, you can be appealed. At least in Baltimore County, there's a hearing officer. If you don't like the decision of the hearing officer, either for or against, you can take an appeal to the Board of Appeals. Every charter county has a Board of Appeals. If you, in Baltimore County, at least there are what's called B-rule appeals. So the appeal of a development plan must be on the record. So, and can only be overturned if there was fraud or some misinterpretation of law. If it was possible for the lower body to reasonably approve it, the Board of Appeals must approve it as well, and you can't put in any new testimony. So the appeal would be on only elements of law. Beyond that, same thing, it could go to the circuit court and then to the Court of Special Appeals and the Maryland Court of Appeals, both about to be renamed, incidentally. What else you got, Carrie?
I've got one more question. So last chance, everyone. David, what is the function of the master water and sewage plan, and does it restrict development?
Okay, what's the function of the master water and sewer plan? In addition to everything else that you need to worry about in whether water and sewer is available, you can have it available. It can be right at your property, but there is a document called the Master Water and Sewerage Plan that every jurisdiction must adopt, and you must be designated correctly in the Master Water and Sewerage Plan, or you can't develop. And changing the Master Water and Sewerage Plan is usually very difficult. In Baltimore County, you have to file by May the 1st. It goes to the Planning Board, it goes to the County Council, it goes to the Maryland Department of the Environment. It takes a long time to change it, and it's expensive to change it, and people forget to look at it. And in Baltimore County and Baltimore City, also, you must be within the metropolitan district. And so you have to look, in doing a feasibility, you have to investigate the Master Water and Sewerage Plan and the Metropolitan District Plan as well, and see if any of those need amendment. Anybody else, Carrie?
Yes, so we just had another question come in. I don't think you can see the chat. This was to everybody. What is your opinion that if nothing else, the state or local jurisdictions cannot deny you of all property development rights? For example, they may not let you do what you want, but they cannot deny you of something that might end up being the lowest and worst use.
Well, I'm not sure. Well, that's a great question, and I have a whole talk I would like to give on that question. And I'm going to rephrase the question. So, what can they do to you? You know, and I have a whole lecture on this. So, and I'm going to talk about this next time. In the Euclid case, which we're going to mention, a property was zoned industrial where it was worth, this is 1926, it was worth $10,000 an acre, and it got zoned residential, which was worth $2,500 an acre. Was that loss compensable under the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution? If the government wanted to come in and take 2/3 of your property, they have to pay you for it, with condemnation and eminent domain. But if they want to strip 2/3 of your property's value away by downzoning it, why don't they have to pay you? And the reason they don't have to pay you is that the Supreme Court held that zoning is an appropriate use of the police power and under the Constitution. And how do we know that the police power is in the Constitution? Because it never says that. Well, the Supreme Court in 1880 told us that it is. It's an implied power. So that the government, in terms of regulation and especially zoning, can strip the value of a property without having to pay for it. Until, well, how far can they go? And I'll talk about this in another lecture. And there have been a series of cases. California Coastal Commission was one. A case out of Hawaii was another. They must leave you some reasonable economic use of the property. And if they don't leave you an economic use of the property, they have to pay you for it because it's the equivalent of a public expropriation of the property. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, and it sounds like more to come on that.
I think more to come. That's a very interesting, the rules that restrict what the government, the limits to the regulation that the government can put on property owners are very interesting. And I think I may very well do that as another talk in this series.
Okay, so David, it looks like that is it. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for that presentation. I'm going to link in the chat the whole series and the upcoming presentations that we'll be doing on the Lunchtime LDC series.
I think we can mic that, please,
Okay.
for a second.
So
Okay, those of you who have done this before know that if you kept your cameras on, we will send you your certificates tomorrow. And our next talk on April 13th, the Crisis in Housing, Vanquishing the Ghost of Euclid, or is it really a vampire? I think you will find very interesting, and you might want to sign up for that one. I hope to see you then.
thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.